The moment the news started circulating around the league, people inside the Indiana Fever organization reportedly went quiet. Not because they were surprised negotiations were happening. Contract talks are normal in professional sports. But because of what happened next. Kelsey Mitchell didn't hesitate. The offer came across the table. The franchise that she had spent nearly a decade carrying through some of its darkest years expected a straightforward answer. After all, loyalty matters in sports. Players who stay through losing seasons often get rewarded when the team finally turns things around. But Mitchell didn't sign. And that one decision instantly created a storm around the Indiana Fever. Inside the league, executives started asking the same question. Fans started debating it online. Even players from other teams quietly began watching the situation closely. What exactly was happening in Indiana? Because from the outside, this should have been the easiest decision in the world. The Fever were finally relevant again. For years, Indiana had been stuck in a brutal cycle of rebuilding seasons. Losing records. Half-empty arenas. Coaching changes that never quite fixed the deeper issues. It was the kind of stretch that quietly pushes players out of franchises. Talented athletes rarely stay long when the losses pile up. But Mitchell did. Year after year, she kept showing up in a Fever uniform. She kept scoring. She kept competing. Even when the standings said the season was basically over by midsummer. And now, suddenly, the entire basketball world was watching Indiana again. The spotlight had never been brighter. The franchise had a generational star. National broadcasts. Sold-out crowds. Everything the organization had been waiting for was finally happening. So why would the player who helped hold the franchise together suddenly refuse the contract sitting in front of her? That's where the story gets complicated. Because this wasn't just a contract negotiation. It was a financial gamble. A league-wide power struggle. And possibly the most important decision of Mitchell's entire career. To understand why the situation exploded the way it did, you have to go back to the beginning, to a time when almost nobody outside Indiana was paying attention. Because long before the arrival of Caitlin Clark, before the sold-out arenas and the national headlines, there was a completely different version of the Fever. And Mitchell was the one trying to keep it alive. When Kelsey Mitchell first arrived in Indianapolis, the excitement around the franchise was nothing like what fans see today. There were no sold-out arenas. No national media storms. No viral highlights dominating sports television. Back in 2018, the Indiana Fever were entering one of the most uncertain stretches in franchise history. Mitchell had just been selected with the second overall pick in the draft after an incredible college career at Ohio State Buckeyes women's basketball. At Ohio State, she had already built a reputation as one of the most dangerous scorers in the country. She finished her college career with more than 2,500 points, becoming one of the most prolific offensive players the Big Ten had ever seen. But the situation waiting for her in Indiana was far from ideal. The Fever were rebuilding. And not the kind of rebuilding that takes 1 or 2 seasons. This was the slow, frustrating kind that stretches across years. Roster changes. Coaching adjustments. Young players trying to figure things out while the losses quietly pile up. For a young star entering the league, it can be one of the toughest environments possible. Because when a team struggles year after year, players start looking for exits. Agents push for trades. Front offices shuffle the roster again and again, hoping something finally clicks. But Mitchell stayed. And season after season, she kept doing the one thing the Fever desperately needed. Scoring. Even as the team struggled to stay competitive in the standings, Mitchell continued to develop into one of the most reliable offensive guards in the league. Night after night she carried the scoring load, often putting up impressive numbers even when the final score didn't go Indiana's way. Some seasons, the team lost more than 20 games. Some nights the arena felt quieter than anyone wanted to admit. But Mitchell still played with the same intensity. She ran the floor like the game mattered. She attacked defenders like the score was tied. She kept competing even when the outcome seemed obvious. Across those difficult seasons, she averaged over 16 points per game. She started more than 200 games in a Fever uniform. And more importantly, she became something every struggling team needs but rarely talks about publicly. Stability. When coaches changed, she was still there. When new rookies arrived trying to adjust to the professional game, she was one of the veterans helping them figure things out. When fans wondered if the team would ever climb back into contention, Mitchell was the player still showing up and giving them something to cheer for. In a league where careers can move quickly and players often change teams searching for better situations, that kind of loyalty stands out. 7 years is a long time in professional sports. Some players don't stay in the league that long. Mitchell spent those years grinding through losing seasons, carrying the offense, and trying to help a franchise rebuild itself piece by piece. And for a long time, it looked like Indiana might stay stuck in that cycle. But then something happened that completely changed the trajectory of the organization. One draft pick, one player, and suddenly the entire basketball world started paying attention to Indiana again. 4 years, the Indiana Fever felt like one of those franchises quietly operating outside the spotlight. Games were played, seasons came and went, and unless you were a dedicated WNBA fan, Indiana rarely dominated the national conversation. Then one moment changed everything. The arrival of Caitlin Clark. Even before she stepped onto a professional court, Clark had already become one of the most talked-about players in basketball. Her college career turned her into a cultural phenomenon. Deep three-pointers from distances most players wouldn't even attempt. Highlight passes that spread across social media within minutes. Packed arenas everywhere she played. So when the Fever secured the opportunity to bring Clark to Indiana, something unusual happened. The attention followed her. Suddenly, games that once struggled to draw national coverage were being scheduled for prime television slots. Ticket demand exploded almost overnight. Fever jerseys started selling at a pace the organization had never experienced before. People who had never watched a WNBA game before were suddenly tuning in just to see Clark play. And with that surge of attention, the entire franchise entered a completely new era. For the first time in years, the Fever were no longer invisible. Every game mattered. Every performance was dissected online. Every highlight circulated across sports media. It felt like the organization had stepped into a spotlight that had been building for years, waiting for the right moment. But something interesting happened inside that spotlight. Because while most of the attention naturally centered around Clark's historic rookie season, another player was quietly putting together the best year of her career. The same player who had been carrying the franchise through all those losing seasons. Kelsey Mitchell. Instead of fading into the background as the new superstar arrived, Mitchell elevated her game even further. In fact, many people inside the league began noticing something surprising. With Clark drawing defensive attention and transforming the pace of the offense, Mitchell suddenly had more opportunities than ever before to do what she had always done best. Score. And what followed became one of the most impressive seasons of her entire professional career. But that breakout year would soon create a new problem that nobody inside Indiana was fully prepared for. Because when a player performs at that level, the price of keeping them changes. When the spotlight arrived in Indiana, many people assumed the entire story would revolve around Caitlin Clark. And to be fair, Clark delivered exactly what the hype promised. She brought an electrifying style of play that pulled millions of new viewers toward the WNBA. Every deep three-pointer, every impossible pass, every clutch moment became another viral highlight. But while the cameras were following Clark, something else was happening on the court. Kelsey Mitchell was having the most explosive season of her career. Instead of shrinking under the new spotlight, Mitchell thrived in it. With defenses suddenly forced to respect Clark's shooting range, the floor opened in ways Indiana had never experienced before. And Mitchell attacked those openings relentlessly. She scored from everywhere. Pull-up jumpers, quick drives to the rim, three-pointers that silenced opposing crowds. Night after night, she proved something that many casual fans were only just beginning to realize. She wasn't just a reliable scorer. She was elite. By the end of the season, Mitchell was averaging over 20 points per game, the highest mark of her career. Her shooting numbers climbed as well, finishing the season hitting nearly 40% of her shots from beyond the arc. Those aren't the numbers of a secondary role player. Those are the numbers of a franchise cornerstone. And the recognition followed. Mitchell earned All-WNBA first-team honors, placing her alongside the best players in the league. She even found herself in conversations surrounding the most valuable player race, something few people predicted before the season began. But the most impressive part of her season came during one of the most difficult stretches the Fever faced. When Clark missed time with injury, the responsibility for keeping Indiana competitive suddenly fell heavily on Mitchell's shoulders. Without the rookie superstar on the floor, opposing defenses focused entirely on stopping her. And yet she still produced. Game after game, she carried the offense, creating shots, pushing the pace, and keeping the Fever within reach of opponents that might have otherwise run away with the game. Even while dealing with a serious health scare that sidelined some athletes for much longer, Mitchell returned and continued playing through the grind of the season. That level of resilience didn't go unnoticed inside the organization. Coaches praised her leadership. Teammates relied on her consistency. Fans who had followed the team through the difficult rebuilding years already knew exactly how valuable she was. But now the entire league was seeing it too. And when a player delivers that kind of season at the exact moment the franchise finally becomes relevant again, something inevitable happens. Their value skyrockets. Suddenly, the quiet veteran who had carried Indiana through years of struggle was no longer just a loyal piece of the roster. She had become one of the most important players in the entire league. Which meant when the season ended, the negotiations were never going to be simple. When the season ended, most people around the league assumed the next step would be simple. The Indiana Fever had finally become one of the most exciting teams in the WNBA. The roster had clear chemistry. The fan base was energized again. And the backcourt pairing of Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell looked like the foundation of something special. From the outside, it felt obvious. Indiana would reward Mitchell for her career season. Mitchell would re-sign. And the Fever would move forward with one of the most dangerous guard duos in the league. But behind the scenes, the situation wasn't that straightforward. When Mitchell's contract expired, she officially entered free agency. Normally, this is where teams negotiate quickly with key players they want to keep. Front offices move fast to lock in important pieces before other teams have the chance to make an offer. But that offseason was different. Because the entire league was operating under a cloud of uncertainty. The current collective bargaining agreement governing the WNBA had just expired. That agreement controls almost everything about the league's financial system. Player salaries, free agency rules, team spending limits, and roster regulations. Without a new deal finalized yet, teams and players were suddenly negotiating inside a system that might soon change dramatically. The Fever still had one option available to them. They could send Mitchell what's known as a core qualifying offer. In simple terms, that designation gives the team exclusive negotiating rights with a player. If Mitchell accepted it, she would remain with Indiana and earn one of the highest salaries allowed under the existing system. For the organization, it was the safest move. It guaranteed that their best scorer wouldn't suddenly walk away. And when the offer arrived, many people expected Mitchell to sign it quickly. After all, she had spent 8 years building her career in Indiana. She had carried the team through its hardest seasons. Now the franchise was finally competitive again. Everything seemed aligned. But Mitchell looked at the numbers carefully. And she realized something important. If a new CBA agreement dramatically increased salaries, something players around the league were pushing for, signing a deal under the old structure could cost her a massive amount of money in the long run. We're not talking about small differences. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. Possibly more. For a professional athlete whose career window is limited, that kind of decision becomes incredibly difficult. Sign now for security. Or wait and potentially earn the contract that truly reflects your value. Mitchell made her choice. She didn't sign. And the moment that decision became known, the calm off-season conversation inside Indiana turned into something much more complicated. Because now the Fever had a problem they weren't expecting. Their most loyal player was suddenly willing to wait. And waiting meant the entire situation could spiral in directions nobody inside the organization could fully control. The longer the uncertainty lasted, the more questions started to appear. Questions about money. Questions about the salary cap. And questions about whether the Fever could actually afford to keep all the players who had helped build this new era of Indiana basketball. At first glance, The situation surrounding Kelsey Mitchell looked like a typical contract negotiation. A star player finishes a career year. Her contract expires. The team tries to keep her. But the deeper front offices looked at the numbers, the more complicated the situation became for the Indiana Fever. Because this wasn't just about Mitchell. It was about the future financial structure of the entire roster. Under the league's current proposal for the next collective bargaining agreement, teams would operate with a salary cap of roughly $5.65 million. That number represents the maximum amount a team can spend on its entire roster. Every contract has to fit under that cap. Every player. Every deal. And here's where things start to get uncomfortable. If Mitchell signs a supermax contract under the new system, she could earn somewhere around $1.13 million per season. That's a massive leap from the salaries players earned under the previous structure. But it also means something else. One player would take up nearly 20% of the team's entire payroll. Now imagine trying to build a championship roster around that. Because Mitchell isn't the only star the Fever need to think about. There's also Aaliyah Boston, one of the most dominant young post players in the league. Boston's next contract will inevitably climb higher as the league's salary structure rises. And then there's the player who transformed the franchise's visibility overnight. Caitlin Clark. Clark's rookie contract is relatively small compared to her impact on the sport. But when that deal eventually expires, the Fever will almost certainly need to offer one of the largest contracts in women's basketball history to keep her. So now the front office is staring at a puzzle that doesn't have an easy solution. Pay Mitchell the full supermax, and a huge portion of the salary cap disappears immediately. Pay Boston what she deserves, and another chunk disappears. Prepare for Clark's future extension, and suddenly the team is trying to fill the rest of the roster with whatever money remains. That's the reality of modern professional sports. Stars deserve to be paid. But the math doesn't always cooperate. If Indiana commits the maximum salary to Mitchell, they could find themselves with far less money to build the kind of deep roster required to compete for a championship. Role players matter. Defenders matter. Bench depth matters. Championship teams rarely rely on only 2 or 3 stars. And that's the tightrope the Fever front office is now trying to walk. They want to reward the player who carried their franchise through years of struggle. But they also need to build a roster capable of competing for titles during the Caitlin Clark era. And those two goals might not fit together as easily as fans would hope. Meanwhile, another layer of uncertainty is making the entire situation even more tense. Because the contract standoff in Indiana isn't just about one team. It's happening during one of the most important financial negotiations in the history of the WNBA. While fans were debating the future of Kelsey Mitchell in Indiana, something even bigger was unfolding behind the scenes of the WNBA. A financial battle that could reshape the entire league. The collective bargaining agreement between the league and the players had officially expired. That agreement is essentially the rulebook for how money works in professional basketball. It determines player salaries, revenue sharing, travel conditions, benefits, and how much teams are allowed to spend. Without a new agreement in place, the league suddenly entered a strange period of uncertainty. Teams didn't know exactly what future payroll limits would look like. Players didn't know what their contracts might be worth just months from now. And both sides were trying to negotiate a deal that could dramatically change the financial landscape of the sport. For years, many WNBA players believed the league's rapid growth wasn't being fully reflected in their salaries. Television ratings were rising. Arena attendance was increasing. Merchandise sales were exploding. Much of that surge had been amplified by the arrival of new stars like Caitlin Clark, whose popularity brought millions of new viewers to the league. But players wanted a larger share of that growth. The union began pushing for a higher percentage of league revenue to be shared with players. Some proposals suggested increasing the salary cap to nearly $9.5 million per team, a massive jump from the numbers teams were currently operating under. League ownership had a different view. Their proposal landed closer to $5.65 million. And that gap between the two numbers created a tense negotiation that could determine the financial future of the entire WNBA. For players entering free agency during that uncertain period, the decision became incredibly difficult. Sign a contract now under the current structure. or wait for the possibility of a much more lucrative system. That's exactly the gamble Mitchell was facing. If she signed early, she could lock in security but potentially leave significant money on the table if the new CBA dramatically increased salaries. But if she waited too long, the Fever might begin exploring other options to protect their roster flexibility. It was a delicate balance. And every day that passed without a deal only increased the tension. Around the league, players started speaking more openly about the uncertainty. Many of them were training for the upcoming season without knowing exactly where they would be playing or what their contracts might look like. For some younger players, it was simply part of the business. But for veterans like Mitchell, the stakes were much higher. At 30 years old, she was entering the stage of her career where long-term financial security becomes incredibly important. Professional athletes don't have decades to maximize their earning potential. Most careers are measured in years. And after spending nearly 8 seasons building the Fever franchise, Mitchell knew this might be the most important contract negotiation of her entire career. Which is why a single word she used during a recent interview suddenly caught the attention of everyone watching the situation unfold. One word that made Fever fans across Indiana pause. At some point during the offseason, Kelsey Mitchell appeared on a podcast hosted by WNBA legend Lisa Leslie. The conversation started like many athlete interviews do. They talked about the league's growth, the excitement surrounding the new generation of players, the energy that had suddenly surrounded the Indiana Fever. But then the topic shifted. Leslie asked Mitchell about the uncertainty players were dealing with while the league negotiated its next financial agreement. And Mitchell answered honestly. She didn't give a polished, media-trained response. She didn't dodge the question. Instead, she described the current moment using a word that immediately caught the attention of fans and analysts. Scary. She said that not knowing what the future holds can be scary. For many fans, hearing that from a veteran player felt unsettling. This wasn't a rookie adjusting to the business side of professional sports. Mitchell had spent nearly a decade navigating contracts, roster changes, and league negotiations. She understood exactly how these situations usually unfold. So when a player with that level of experience describes the moment as scary, people tend to listen. And she didn't say it once. She said it twice. Mitchell explained that many players across the league were dealing with the same uncertainty. Teammates who were currently playing in off-season competitions together were all facing similar questions about their futures. Which team would they play for next season? What kind of contracts would be available? Would the new financial structure dramatically change their earning potential? Those questions weren't hypothetical anymore. They were real decisions that players had to make. For Fever fans listening to the interview, the message between the lines felt clear. Mitchell wasn't guaranteeing she would stay in Indiana. She wasn't promising anything. Instead, she was acknowledging that the situation across the league was unstable, and that every player had to think carefully about what came next. Inside the Fever organization, support for Mitchell remained strong. Coaches had repeatedly praised her leadership. Teammates had publicly spoken about how important she was to the locker room. Even players like Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston reportedly wanted to see her return. But praise and contracts are two very different things. Compliments don't guarantee roster spots. And loyalty, while meaningful, doesn't always determine the final decision when negotiations reach this level. Mitchell had spent 8 years helping build the foundation of the Fever. Now she had to decide what that foundation was actually worth. Because if the organization couldn't match her value financially, another team in the league almost certainly would. And that leads to the question nobody in Indiana wants to answer out loud. What happens if she leaves? There's a question floating quietly around the Indiana Fever organization right now. Not one the front office wants to say out loud, but one that everyone involved has thought about at least once. What happens if Kelsey Mitchell actually leaves? Because when fans imagine losing a player, they usually focus on statistics. Points per game, shooting percentages, maybe a few highlight plays that will suddenly disappear from the offense. But Mitchell's impact on Indiana goes much deeper than numbers on a stat sheet. Last season she averaged over 20 points per game. That alone would be extremely difficult to replace. Reliable scorers at that level don't grow on trees in the WNBA. But the real loss would be everything happening around those points. Mitchell has spent nearly a decade inside the Fever locker room. She understands the rhythm of the organization, the expectations of the coaching staff, and the emotional ups and downs of the franchise better than almost anyone else. When the team struggled through rebuilding seasons, she was one of the players setting the tone. When younger players arrived, she helped them adjust to the professional level. And when the franchise suddenly became the center of attention after the arrival of Caitlin Clark, Mitchell became one of the steady voices keeping the locker room grounded. That kind of presence doesn't show up in box scores. But coaches value it more than fans sometimes realize. Now imagine removing that piece from the roster. Suddenly, the Fever offense would lean heavily on Clark for creation and scoring. Clark is an incredible talent, but even the best players in the world need support around them. Basketball isn't a one-person sport. Defenses adjust quickly when they only need to focus on one primary scoring threat. Without Mitchell spacing the floor and attacking defenses, opponents could shift more attention towards stopping Clark. And that changes everything. The offense slows down. The spacing tightens. The pressure on Clark increases dramatically. There's another factor that makes the situation even more complicated. Injuries. Every professional season is long and unpredictable. Players miss games. Sometimes stars are forced to sit out stretches of the schedule. Last season proved exactly how important Mitchell could be during those moments. When Clark missed time, Mitchell stepped into the role of primary offensive engine. She created shots. She carried scoring responsibilities. She kept the Fever competitive during games that could have easily slipped away. Take that safety net away, and suddenly every injury becomes far more dangerous for the team's success. But the ripple effects might not stop there. Because the Fever roster has several other key players approaching important contract decisions as well. Players like Sophie Cunningham bring intensity, toughness, and defensive energy that teams desperately need during playoff runs. Others provide perimeter defense, rebounding, and the kind of gritty work that doesn't always grab headlines but wins games in the long run. If Indiana commits a massive portion of its salary cap to keeping Mitchell, it might struggle to retain some of those pieces. But if the Fever lose Mitchell entirely, they may struggle to replace her offensive firepower in the first place. It's a difficult balancing act. Keep the star who helped build the foundation of the team. Or redistribute that money across the roster and hope the overall depth improves. That's the decision quietly unfolding behind closed doors right now. And while the Fever front office works through those possibilities, another group of people around the league is watching the situation very carefully. Other teams. Because if Indiana hesitates too long, someone else might step in. While the Indiana Fever try to figure out the numbers, other teams around the WNBA are quietly paying attention. Front offices always watch situations like this. When a proven scorer enters uncertainty, phones start ringing. Agents receive calls. Executives begin asking the same question behind closed doors. What would it take to bring her here? Because players with the resume of Kelsey Mitchell rarely become available. She's a guard who can create her own shot. She's a veteran with playoff experience. She's someone who has already proven she can carry an offense when necessary. And perhaps most importantly, she's entering the stage of her career where she still has several high-level seasons left. That combination makes her incredibly valuable. Across the league, there are multiple teams that would immediately benefit from adding a scorer like Mitchell. One name that has been whispered more than once in league circles is the Chicago Sky. Chicago has been searching for consistent offensive firepower, especially from the guard position. A veteran scorer who can stretch defenses and create shots instantly makes their offense more dangerous. For a team trying to climb back into contention, a player like Mitchell could change the entire dynamic. And Chicago isn't the only organization paying attention. Expansion teams entering the league over the next few seasons will need experienced players who can establish culture and leadership inside brand new locker rooms. A veteran guard with Mitchell's reputation could become the kind of centerpiece those franchises want to build around. From a business perspective, it also makes sense. Mitchell isn't just productive on the court. She brings credibility, experience, and stability. Exactly the kind of presence new teams often seek when building a roster from scratch. which means every day that the situation in Indiana remains unresolved, more opportunities could quietly appear for her elsewhere. And that's where the pressure on the Fever front office begins to increase. Because loyalty works both ways. Mitchell stayed with the organization during years when the franchise was struggling to stay competitive. She endured losing seasons, roster rebuilds, and long stretches where national attention was almost non-existent. Now that the team has finally reached the spotlight, she has to decide whether Indiana is still the best place for the next chapter of her career. Meanwhile, Fever fans are watching every development closely. Some believe the franchise must do whatever it takes to keep her. Others argue that the team needs financial flexibility to build around Caitlin Clark for the long term. Both arguments have merit. And if you've been following this situation closely, you probably realize just how complicated this decision really is. These kinds of roster moves can shape an entire era of basketball for a franchise. So if you enjoy breaking down stories like this and seeing how the business side of sports affects what happens on the court, this is exactly the kind of situation worth keeping an eye on as it develops. Because the next move the Fever make could define their future for years. And the clock is ticking. Mitchell is approaching the most important contract decision of her career. Indiana is trying to protect its championship window. Other teams are waiting for an opportunity. And when situations like this reach their breaking point, the final outcome often surprises everyone.